Alright guys, today I am talking drive shaft repair. Specifically, I posted a couple short videos recently detailing about how I damaged my rear drive shaft, the secondary part of the drive shaft that goes from the carrier bearing down into that rear axle. I got a little tangled up in some rocks, a little too much skinny pedal, got a nice dent in it, and had to get that repaired. Now this video is not going to be like a how-to of how to go repair your own drive shaft, but there's just a lot of different options out there about how to approach a damaged drive shaft, and I spent a lot of time thinking and analyzing all of the different options. So I'm just going to be talking to the camera a little bit, giving you some general pros and cons of different methods and how I ended up deciding what I ended up going with. So the first thing that you can do is nothing. If you have a dent in your drive shaft, you're going to get some vibration. It might be uncomfortable, but maybe it's only a little bit of vibration, and maybe it's not something that bothers you. In my case, it was something that I noticed, and it bothered me, but most of my passengers, when they were in my vehicle, didn't notice unless there was like some change rattling in a cup holder or something like that. That being said, obviously that is free, but you don't want to transmit that vibration energy into your carrier bearing or into your pinion gears. So it's not something you want to leave unchecked indefinitely. You do want to get it straightened out. All of that shaking of an unbalanced drive shaft is going to, like I said, it excites whatever ends are supporting that out of balance shaft. And in my case, I didn't want to, start wearing out seals or wear out gears in that rear axle. I wanted to make sure that that was taken care of. Now the next level up is you could remove your drive shaft and you could take it to a driveline shop to get rebalanced. That's where they're going to weld on a weight at a certain position on the drive shaft to try and make it balance and turn smoothly. That being said, that's going to be heavily dependent on how much damage you actually have. If the dent is very deep, it may not be able to be balanced, and in that case you're still kind of on the hook for paying the shop fee. If they're taking the U-joints out, putting it on a lathe and spinning it up and checking it, you're still going to end up paying for that labor even if the balance does not work. So although that is kind of a cheaper way that you might be able to do that for about $200, it is kind of risky in that it may not actually work. One level up from that is a junkyard drive shaft, and this is something that I heavily considered. Most of the pull-apart junkyards around me did not have any third-gen Tacomas in there. These are newer vehicles with a little bit more value even when scrapped. So I was looking at car-part.com, which is the interchange website where you can look up which junkyards have different parts. And I was able to find various rear drive shafts from OEM Tacomas for around like $300 to $400 range. So that is getting a little bit more expensive, but that gets you the entire drive shaft. It does kind of depend a little bit on logistics. So in my case, it was just kind of a logistical nightmare trying to figure out how to do it. The nearest place that I found near me was over an hour drive one way just to pick up the drive shaft. That being said, when I called them, they said they didn't actually have it there. It was in their Atlanta warehouse somewhere, and that they would have to get it shipped. Shipping was free, but I would still have to wait a couple weeks, have it shipped to their facility, go drive an hour, pick it up. They charge you a core charge. So then you pick it up. You can either swap it in the parking lot if you want to do that, or you bring it back to your house an hour away, swap it out. Now you got the old dented drive shaft that you could take back out. And then you're going to end up driving another hour to get your core charge back. So logistically, just depending on where you are in relation to the salvage yards around you that have the part that you need, it could just be a little bit of a logistical concern. The other thing that I did have a concern with is that although it would probably be much better balanced than a dented up drive shaft, there's no real guarantee that it is properly balanced. All of these wrecked vehicles have been in collisions. You could be driving really fast, hit a wall, come to a nice shock load where tires and wheels and driveline comes to a sudden stop. That could get tweaked here. You don't know if the truck was picked up by a forklift, and that drive shaft does kind of hang down below the frame a little bit. So that fork could get up underneath it and give it a little ding. And so you could end up spending $300 or $400 and getting a drive shaft that is, maybe better than what you had from the rocks, but still not actually fixing the problem. So now we're going to get into the different options with specialty driveline shops. This is not something that a normal mechanic is going to be able to do, but you really need to take it to a machine shop that specializes in drive shafts. So you could go for a retube only, which is where the machinist will grind out the welds on the end of the tube, and then they will take the tube out, they will replace it with the tube, and they will go ahead and replace it with the exact same type of tube that you had on there to begin with. But basically you're just cutting out the old tube, welding in a new tube, and keeping all of your old parts. And that can end up reusing U-joints, reusing weld yokes, reusing flange yokes, reusing carrier bearings, reusing your primary shaft coming out of the transfer case, and just repairing, just localize the part that is actually damaged. The other thing that you got to take into consideration is the whole while you're in there type of situation. $500-ish was about what I was quoted from a couple different shops, but that was assuming they reused everything. That being said, to do all that work on the drive shaft, you're going to end up pressing out the old U-joints. You're going to end up separating a lot of the other components. So, while you're in there, you might as well spend $30 a U-joint and get fresh U-joints and kind of reset the clock on that, right? And same thing with U-joints, flange yokes, carrier bearing. And so you do end up with this opportunistic upgrade or replacing, preventative maintenance of the other parts on the drive shaft. I will say that when you do a retube, typically you're going to reuse the exact same type of tube that was on there before, and that's because on the ends of the drive shaft where the weld yokes go in, the weld yokes have a kind of cylinder that sticks into the inner diameter of the actual tube, and so you need to have a tight fit where that cylinder goes into the tube. And so if you get a thicker wall tube, the outer diameter will be the same, and it's the wall thickness on the inside that is going to be increased. And so now that weld yoke is not going to fit in. So typically you're going to end up getting the same strength tube that you had on there originally. So if you do want to take it a step farther and get kind of like an off-roading specific drive shaft, you can get a custom lower shaft, which is going to be the lower shaft that is more susceptible to rock damage. And you can get thicker wall tube if you're willing to pay the extra money for new weld yokes, so that way that cylinder mates with the inner diameter of that tube. One of the driveline shops that I talked to actually specialized in kind of off-roading. That was their hobby that got them into making drive shafts. And they said they make drive shafts up to 3/8 wall thickness, which is incredibly big. So that's something for, rock hopping buggies and things like that. But, he said he makes common drive shafts out of 120 wall thickness drawn over mandrel, same type of thing that rock sliders are in, and that can really take a hit. That's going to get you up into that $700 range, based on the shops near me. But that definitely is an option, and the same type of while you're in there applies as a general retube, right? It's just taking it a next step further, replacing the weld yokes and getting an even stronger tube. So if you're doing some aggressive off-roading, that could be an option as well. Now, typically you would only really upgrade that secondary part of the drive shaft that goes from the carrier bearing down into that rear axle. The first part of the drive shaft is mostly horizontal and kind of tucked up under the frame, and it's not really that prone to damage. So another option that people talk about on Tacoma World and other message boards and forums a lot is going to be replacing your two-piece drive shaft with a custom-built single-piece drive shaft. Now, this is largely done on lifted vehicles to try and mellow out the angle of the drive shaft where it mates with your rear axle at the pinion flange. So as you lift your vehicle, your frame gets taller, your axle stays where it is, and therefore your drive shaft is at a sharper angle going into that rear axle. And so that can cause driveline vibrations if that U-joint is constantly running at a sharp angle. Now, when I talked to the drive shaft shop that specializes in off-roading, his recommendation was to leave it at a two-piece drive shaft, and his logic and experience was that that first part of the drive shaft is tucked away in the frame pretty good, and it's less susceptible to rock strikes. And if all you're worried about is vibration, it's better to take pinion shims, so that way you can angle your entire axle upwards more and line it up with the secondary shaft. And if you really wanted to upgrade something for the rocks, you should just focus on a custom secondary shaft and not replace the entire thing with a single one-piece shaft. Now, from the official service recommendation from Toyota, it's going to be to just replace the entire drive shaft assembly. And so you can look at Rock Auto for, kind of general aftermarket support, but those are still going to be around anywhere between $600 and $800. And if you look at an OEM drive shaft, that's anywhere from like $800 to $1,300, depending on what options and what configurations of your vehicle that you have. So there are different drive shaft designs depending on whether you have four-wheel drive, two-wheel drive, short bed, long bed, or automatic or manual transmissions. And so that'll impact the length of the shaft and how much that's going to cost. In my case, I would never recommend buying the OEM drive shaft. If you're going to spend almost $1,000, I would rather do that at a specialty machine shop and get a heavy duty drive shaft made, or I would rather save the money and just get a general retube. So that's something that I looked into briefly, but I never really considered it because it was just cost prohibitive compared to the other options that I could get for similar or less cost. So although that is an option, and that's probably what a general mechanic would do, is just order a new drive shaft and put it in for you. If you're going to be doing any of the work yourself, or if you're able to take the drive shaft off yourself, then there's a lot better options out there. So at the end of the day, what would I recommend? Well, what I did is I removed my drive shaft, and I took it to a local drive shaft shop. So that cost me around $600 to go from 80 thousandths to 95 thousandths wall thickness tube. Got nice and balanced, and they went ahead and replaced all of the U-joints. I installed that and it worked great, but it was $600. If the junkyard was closer to me and it was easier and more convenient to get to, then I would recommend a pull apart type junkyard, or a full service salvage yard that pulls the parts yourself, assuming that it's not going to be too much of an inconvenience to get to. One thing that you do have to take into consideration when removing your drive shaft and taking it somewhere local is that then you can't drive your vehicle, at least not regularly. So I have a 4-wheel drive truck, so I did remove my rear drive shaft and I put it in 4 high. I was able to drive around like that, and it took about 10 days for me to get my rear drive shaft back. Now, that's not necessarily something that Toyota is going to recommend in the owner's manual, to drive on 4-wheel drive without a rear drive shaft. And in my case, I was staying on, no more than 55 miles per hour. I was kind of limping around and being very careful just to make sure that everything was handling and driving the way that I wanted it. And I was able to kind of limp it around for 10 days to get my drive shaft back. But if it is something that you have a 2-wheel drive truck, then you might want to consider something like a junkyard, where you can keep your existing drive shaft, drive it around, pick up a new drive shaft, swap it out, and then return it at your leisure. It just depends on the logistics and other methods of transportation that you have available to you. So that's all that I have to say about drive shaft repair today. Hopefully me sharing my thought process and decision-making process can help you better analyze the different options that may be available to you if you're in a similar situation with a damaged or broken drive shaft. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content of these videos. Comment below if you have questions or suggestions for future videos. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.